Welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres. Today it's episode 111. So here we are live on YouTube, and today we're going to be talking about fog, mist, that kind of weather condition which can create incredibly atmospheric photos if you know what you're doing. And it's one of those things where I think whenever you're in the fog, whenever you're in the mist, you kind of really feel this sort of sense of otherworldliness and you really want to capture it. But the camera doesn't always capture that full sense of what's going on. So over a period of time, I've had several people sort of talk about, problems they've had with fog photos. And I've kind of touched on different areas, but I don't think I've ever actually done a full podcast on the idea of it. So that's what we're going to be talking about this afternoon. I'll say this afternoon, it's 3 p.m. UK time, 4 p.m. European time, I think, morning in the Americas and evening in Asia. So we've got a full set of conditions today, as always, really. Right, okay, so yeah, that's what we're going to be talking about. So here we are live on YouTube, and what we're going to be talking about is fog. Also, the other thing is we have a bit of critique section. We've had 5 people send in images for critique today. So after I've talked about fog, I'm going to be taking a little look at that, and also I'm going to don't rush off at the end because I want to tell you about next weekend. Next weekend is Spring Fling. Tell you a little bit more about that, about the fact that I won't be doing a full podcast, or probably any real podcast, but I am going to be trying to do some live streaming periodically throughout the weekend. I say weekend, it's actually from Thursday. Anyway, I'll give you a lot more information about that earlier. Meanwhile, right now, here we're live, unless you happen to be watching the recorded episodes, and of course there are 110 previous episodes to watch if you wish. Just go to YouTube/Kim Ayres, also youtube.com/Kim Ayres, where you can find all the previous episodes. But if you are watching live, leave me a comment. Let me know where you are. Let me know what the weather's like. Let me know any thoughts you've got. Leave questions, leave comments, leave nice praise for people's photos that they've sent in. Anything you like, right? Well, within reason. It's also a bit of a family show, so do watch the language. Right, I can see we have various comments in already. So let's say, so Meg says, hello everyone, that's my daughter. Peter says hello. Maggie says, hello everyone from Castle Douglas. May Britt says, hello everyone from a cloudy Copenhagen. Binod says, hello everyone. I think Binod is in India, is that right? Peter says, hello from Annan in Dumfries and Galloway. Anya's here from Brussels, where it's raining regular showers. Yes, Binod says it is a good evening from India. Nadia here is there and says hello everyone. Lisa says hello from Madrid. Nice and sunny. It's a sunny emoji coming up there, so nice and warm in Madrid, hopefully. Rosemary says good morning to everyone from a drizzly 48 degrees, that's Fahrenheit, not Celsius, wet in Washington State. Binod says there's network issues. If you're not sure, try just refreshing the page. Occasionally that seems to work. Rosemary says, is everyone else missing sound or is it just me? I hope it's just you. As far as I'm aware, sound seems to be, it's certainly going through this bit. So hopefully it's on your end, not mine. Stacey says, good morning to all. Nice and sunny here on Memorial Day weekend. Maybrit says she's got sound. Stacey says, last weekend she went on an outing with the photography club. And Becca says, good afternoon, everyone. Cold here. Rosemary is saying it is tech on my end, sound check okay. Great, that's okay. And Anya and Maggie are also saying the sound is fine. Bit of a relief. Wouldn't be the first time we've had technical issues on this show. The wonders of going live. Right, so yes, fog, mist, these strange atmospheric conditions. And this was kind of kick-started by Rosemary a couple of weeks ago, put in a fog photo. And I answered some questions there, sort of gave her a bit of feedback on that, but really started thinking about the fact that fog is one of those very particular kind of conditions which isn't necessarily easy and obvious to work out how to get the most out of. And then on top of that, 3 of the people who sent in photos for critique this week have also put in fog related photos. So it just seemed like a really good idea to just do a podcast on this, something that you can come back and refer to again. So let's kick off. Essentially, the main thing to understand about fog is what you really need, nearly always, is a sense of depth. Now, okay, so let me talk about this. What have I got here? I scribbled down a couple of notes earlier. Well, first of all, what's the difference between mist and fog? And basically, it's about density. If a quick Google, I can't remember off the top of my head, but a quick Google will tell you that from an official weather point of view, it's essentially if you can see beyond a certain number of meters, or you can't see beyond a certain number of meters, it counts as fog. And if you can see beyond a certain amount but not beyond a certain other amount, then that counts as mist. But it kind of forms in different ways. Sometimes you have low clouds. Sometimes you can be above the clouds. You know, you could be up and the mist can be in the valley. But it might be quite clear above it. So there's different kinds of setups for it. There's different kinds of times when you will find that it's... but when you're actually kind of in amongst it, it has this effect. It has this sort of strange way of being. In a way, yeah. Well, you know what it's like. It always feels odd when you're standing in the fog. You feel like you're in a slightly different world somehow. Now, the three things I'm going to talk about with relation to this is, one is this sense of depth, which is, well, the sense of depth gets all the way through it. I'm going to use some different examples, I think. Let's just make a start. Let me throw up some pictures here and give you a sense of what I'm talking about. So I'm going to start with the notion of trees in the mist. So let me flip over here, and what we can see here is woodland, it's misty, and as it goes back, as it disappears into this, so in the foreground, the trees are really quite, you know, we can see the full kind of depth of range. There's the deep blacks in the shadows. We've got the full tonal range. But as it goes back, as we move further and deeper into the woods, it gets more and more faded until eventually it sort of disappears out into just a dull grey. And this then is key number one about the idea of trying to create an effective mist or fog photo. And that is depth. Because it fades the further you go back, the more effect you get. And so the more of that you can include into the photo, the more effective your fog photo is going to be. Now, you still might want to be thinking about things like rule of thirds or leading lines or use of diagonals or whatever. All the other compositional tricks can come into play. But first and foremost, when you're faced with a fog, low cloud, misty situation, start thinking about that notion of depth. How can I have something in the foreground and something in the background? And maybe, you know, whether it's pillars and posts, trees, all these kind of things. So, you know, it might be, let's say, you know, in this case here, we've got another kind of tree. Now, in this point, the sun is also coming through in the background. And that then is enabling another sense, which is backlight. Backlight, again, then gives a sense of depth because there's a light behind the object or objects that you're looking at. And so again, the big thing about photography is a two-dimensional medium. When we look at the photo is either just ink dots on a flat piece of paper or pixels on a flat screen. We are creating the illusion of depth. Okay, there is actually no depth in the image you are seeing except for how the brain interprets it. So if we want people to get a real sense of what's before them, we have to be able to trick their brain into seeing what we want them to see. So you can see in a sense like this, again, a misty wood, the tree in the foreground here, you know, relatively clear and straightforward. This one fuzzier, these ones very fuzzy until eventually it kind of disappears out. But we also know the sun is behind there, and that sun is creating silhouettes and levels of depth and silhouettes within that. Another one, I think I showed this one a couple of weeks ago, which is where you have, you know, this one I've converted to black and white. If actually I have a colour version of this as well. Now, in this case, it's sort of, and I've colour enhanced it slightly to kind of emphasise the sort of blues in the shade and the kind of warmth in the sun here. But whether you have this one or you have the black and white one, again, what you have is you have the darker silhouettes over here in the foreground. You have the lighter silhouettes as you move through. And that just gives you a sense of, rather than these trees all being flat in a line, you do get a sense of them disappearing into the picture. And again, the sun, the backlight is helping that. Even without backlight, something like this. Now here we've got, you get a real sense of these trees being smaller, but also disappearing into the mist below. We're aware we're up on a hill, and that is, whilst the mist is all around us, it's thicker as it sort of drops down into the valley part of it. So this is, now sometimes you can have a sense of, this is the bit where I'm talking about where you're actually not in the mist itself. You're looking into the valley, and the mist is sort of between the trees, or is in layers, and that can always be a fun, interesting bit. And at that point, you're looking ideally to have something like a hill or trees or something poking out the top, because then that's giving you that real sense of the mist and the depth in between. Again, it helps in this case with anchoring in the foreground a nice strong tree silhouetted virtually against that mist. So that then being your kind of starting point, I think, look for the idea of depth, and certainly when you're starting out, one of the best things to do is trees. Trees are a wonderful, because it's, trees that are disappearing. But again, even if you're in an urban environment, railings, a gate, a hedge, or if you're outdoors, a stone wall, roads, something which is disappearing into the distance, and as it gets further back, it fades, and that tricks the brain into seeing it as a three-dimensional image disappearing into the picture. So that's a kind of starting point with the idea with mist. Now, the second idea with fog and mist is to get near water, especially if there's no wind. If it's completely calm, then what happens is the water becomes completely reflective. And when it's completely reflective, but the mist is about, the horizon line disappears. So let me show you a couple of photos here then, where, to give you an example. So let's say we start off with this one. In this case, we've got, it's incredibly, there's virtually no wind at all. So there's no ripples. So this has become almost exactly a mirror, except for the fact that there's no real horizon. Now we've got the horizon here, which is where the water is running to the reflection. But then once we sort of step out from the end of it, there is no horizon, because that part of it, the horizon is hidden behind the mist, and the mist is being reflected in the water. There's no horizon line. And that kind of just feels a bit strange, a bit weird. Here's another example. And in this case, again, we've got trees disappearing into the distance, giving us that sense of depth. Here in the foreground, we've got all these reeds, and these reeds are kind of sticking out the water. Now, essentially with a horizon line like that, but because there's not a breath of air on the water, no ripples at all, we've got this incredible mirror-like kind of thing. And these just look like this sort of strange mirror-like writing, which is just sort of hanging in the middle of nowhere. So it makes it quite eerie, quite strange. You can kind of zoom in and kind of capture little bits, and at this point you can get really abstract. Just these two little reeds poking up out of the water, and your brain is having to interpret. Here that, okay, if I zoom right in, you can just about see the water tension as it kind of grabs the edge, and then the reflection is slightly darker because essentially it's in shadow in a way, and then there's a little bit of ripple here. But it takes your brain a little moment to try and work out what it is you're seeing. And when you see something like this, also a nice little kind of rule of thirds is helping you to give that sense of bigger space around it. Sometimes you take something like this, so like I say, you could isolate like that, or you can kind of keep a sense of maybe you want to have, you know, bits of tree and landscape coming in to give it a but you can see you allow the to just kind of fade out into the background, give it a bit of space around it. Again, this one zoomed in reeds. This one, you cut the top off the reeds and the bottom off, and then that way you end up with, you know, there's no horizon, but at the same time there's no top or bottom either, and it gets very abstract at that point, and you've really got to start thinking about what's going on. Otherwise, you can sometimes, I mean, like this wasn't just mist. There was a thin layer of ice on the loch when I took this one, and I've got a funny feeling this is actually a colour photo. This isn't even a black and white. I don't think this has even been converted to black and white. It's just everything is so greyed out, and of course the gulls are black and white and grey as well. That, yeah, there's, if I zoom right in, there's a couple of bits of chromatic aberration there. There's, you know, there's little bits of colour in the thing. So this is in fact a colour photo, that you would never really believe it. But having these, it's sort of slightly, so we've got this wonderful kind of reflection here, but having these clearer, but then the tree in the background, this kind of little tree island thing, all misty, that's giving us this sense of depth. And as is this photo here, which is always tended to do rather well in the online competitions, Swan in the Mist. Again, so you've got, you know, it's a great minimalism photo. The swan just sort of sits there, got the slight reflection. Everything else, you know, again, no horizon as such. But then we've got this little bit of tree island in the background. And so that use then of water can be a wonderful way of playing with fog and mist. So if it's a really still day and the water is just giving you that mill pond sort of mirror-like reflection, then, you know, so if you've got a foggy day, try and find a still piece of water and you can get some fantastic, beautiful, abstract, eerie kind of photos. Now, the third thing that I want to mention about the use of mist and fog is nighttime photography. Now, anybody who's ever driven at night knows the problem that when you flip your headlights on, and especially if you put it on full beam and it's a foggy night, the light just reflects straight back on you. It just sort of hits the mist or the fog and bounces straight back and pretty much blinds you, or, you know, or at least creates a wall. You can't see beyond. You can see less than if you actually have your headlights on dip lights. And so a lot of cars then have fog lights, and fog lights actually aren't up where the main full beam is. They tend to be down lower, so they're kind of trying to hit the road without hitting so much of the mist, so that you can see that little bit further along. So if you've got fog and you've got night, how can you see anything? And here, the real trick is backlight completely. So backlight is either going to work through a light source like the moon, like the sun does during the day, that we saw earlier, or maybe we can use the moon as a backlight, or you can use street lights. But generally speaking, what you might need is a series of street lights. Okay, I'm just a couple of comments have come in. I'll just sort of, John's here saying, checking in slightly late from Ohio, Ditch Digger, who is, I'm going to be talking to about his picture later. That's Jim. Okay, slight tangent here. It sometimes gets quite complicated here because there's quite a few people don't use their real names as their YouTube handle, and so I'm doing constant translations as I go. So I'm trying to remember Ditch Digger is Jim. The Bevs, Karen is here, says Karen's late for the party. Oh, Vigi's arrived, hi. And I know there's a few more, so forgive me if I don't quite get all the names right. Rosemary says the merging of the water into the fog above with no horizon line is very effective for conveying the moodiness of your fog. Examples are beautiful. Thank you. Stacey says, I was a wildflower preserve last Sunday, and because of the rain, saw mist when temperatures were rising. I took photographs, haven't edited yet, anxious to see them after your shots. And Becca says, love the minimalist aspect. So yeah, that especially when you are photographing on still water and you've got those reflections, it's a real place to go for minimalism. and play with that notion and the no horizon and reflections. I think there's so much fun to be had with that kind of thing. Anyway, so to return then, the idea of night photography, night fog photography, I should say, is it becomes even trickier. Now, you can, when there's night and there's mist, you can sometimes get that notion. You can find places where the mist is kind of maybe a little bit more scattered. So, for example, let's show you this one. Now, at this point, what you're needing, you will be needing this, because it's nighttime photography, long exposures. So in this case, this one was a 15-second exposure, I think, ISO 320. Now, here, the fog was kind of coming and going. The mist was coming and going. You can tell by the way the light diffuses with the moon that basically the mist has just lifted a bit here. You can still see that it's sort of slightly more over there on the edge of the loch. But again, it's a really still evening. And so we've got these kind of beautiful reeded reflections in the loch. But again, anchored with some sort of nice dark silhouetted trees over on the right. However, if you're into a kind of, that kind of deeper, here we've got mist, again, moon behind. Now I'm on a wide angle lens. This is a 30-second exposure. Again, anchoring with a strong silhouetted foreground tree. And then these ones are sort of getting further out. These ones are fading back even more. So that's, again, helping to give you a sense of depth with this. Now, sometimes, again, you can, that kind of mist coming up the valley type thing. Let's show you this one. This is a nighttime shot. Now, this one had... This again is a 30-second exposure, and it's I was finding that strange thing that that actually because when you're out at night, even in moonlight, everything looks like it's in black and white. But that's because of the receptors in your eyes that I think you've got the cones and rods. I can't remember which way around it is. I think the rods are the ones that interpret light and dark. The cones are the ones that interpret colour, and the rods have got a wider variation in the light range that they can see than the cones can. So when you get to night, basically the rods can still operate, but the cones don't. And that's essentially why it tends to look like it's in black and white. Even though the colour is there, your eyes aren't actually detecting it. Whereas when you do a long exposure with the camera and you've got moonlight, lo and behold, all the colour is still there. So, we can still see the moss on the hedgerow. But this was when I was out, and we can see here, I've just got above the mist from that. But you can still see the moon, you can still see some stars in the sky. Now, I had a couple of other ones of that. Where was the other one I wanted to talk about? Yeah, this was just from a slightly different angle. In fact, actually, you can see Orion up there. And you can see, again, the mist down in the valley. And then there was another one I had. Where were we? This one. Yes, I'd actually climbed up a bit. We'd driven through this mist, and then come out into a clearing. We climbed up to a higher raised part, and then noticed it all kind of coming in, pouring into the valley over here. And again, we've got Orion out there again. We've got Moon up here, but we've got the mist kind of coming in. So that notion of so even at night time, especially if you've got a full moon or something like that, and you can find a nice landscape, you can create some really interesting images with that. But where else was but what I was also going to talk about is I mentioned the notion of a kind of an urban shooting as well. And so let's just show you this one here. So this is fog at night. Now I think this one was handheld, so it was 80th of a second. And because it's an 80th of a second, the ISO is 6,400, so it's actually very, very grainy. But the thing about that is you put it into black and white and it just looks, it kind of adds a bit more atmosphere, kind of a bit more like The Exorcist in some way, I think. But the thing is here, so we've got the street disappearing into the fog, and actually the lights are really helping with this. So, you know, the light is spreading out here, but the fact that the lights are getting smaller and fainter as it goes down the road, and likewise these cars that are down the side, this one, you know, quite dark, we still feel, and as we go further up, the definition is disappearing and disappearing and disappearing. So a nighttime photo, really, if you're trying to get that sense of depth, that's where multiple lights are going to help. And in essence, there's kind of, so we'll come back to Jim's photo in a little bit. That's where you're at. There is one other thing that I wanted to talk about, which is to go back to that idea of mist and sunshine. That sometimes, if you're really lucky, and I've only ever found it once. There was one day when I looked out the window and it was mist, but there was a quality to the sunshine cutting through the mist, and I went down to the woods, and the light was just absolutely incredible as it went through the trees. And this is where I ended up with sunbeams. You don't usually see this. In order to see a shaft of light, you have to have some kind of particle within it. So that's where we're very often using smoke machines or wide light. When it cuts through smoke, you suddenly see the beams of light, which you don't on a clear day. And generally speaking, in a woods, you know, even if it is a fairly misty, foggy day, it will tend to be over the woods and not sort of in the woods. But this time there was mist in the woods and there was light coming through. And so you end up with these brilliant shafts of light. Or this one here again, where you can just see these beams cutting through the trees. And there was another one here where you kind of make sure you stand behind, you put the tree between you and the sun, and then all the light kind of beams around it. So it's just beautiful, incredible effects that you can get from that. So that's kind of really what I wanted to talk about with the idea of fog and a mist and trying to photograph it. Your key things then to take away are, you first and foremost, you are trying to work out how to create a sense of depth in when the mist seems to sometimes just flatten everything. And the best way to do that is to make sure you have objects in the foreground and objects in the background. And ideally, what will really accentuate that is if you have a set of objects in between. So a set of cars, trees, railings, wall, road, anything which is disappearing into the fog is going to get fainter as it gets further away, and that in turn fools the eye on the printed paper because it gets faded and disappears, into giving it a real sense of depth. So that's your first thing. Whenever you're out in fog or mist, think to yourself, how can I get the depth? What do I need in the foreground, and what do I to anchor it so that the background seems to have faded away? The second thing then is the idea of water. If you have the opportunity, if it's a foggy day and you can get near a lake, a pond, somewhere, but especially if there's no breeze, so that you get these wonderful reflections, then the smallest little thing sticking out of the water is going to have a mirror-like reflection and no horizon. So that's going to look really cool if you can get something there. Even if you have to make a little paper boat and stick it out on the water, you will still find that it looks really quite amazing. And then the third thing here, which ties in with, is really the notion of backlight. If you've got light behind the smoke or mist, that allows interesting light patterns to happen through it. So whether that's the moon or the sun or street lights or any other kind of, or any other kind of light, if you've got light behind the mist as well, that will give you a sense of depth and it will create some quite amazing light effects. So hope you found that interesting. Hope you can now take some of these ideas into your photography next time you happen to end up with a foggy or misty day. Okay, see a few more comments here. What have we got? Peter says, nice night shots. Lisa says, amazing shot of the city. VG says, lovely, the moon, the mountains, and are they stars? Yes, they were stars. Nick Bath says, grainy but nice. Glad you could make it. Oh, actually, see, you said hello all earlier. Vijay says, the street in the foggy night, cars, looks just like an old movie. Absolute movie still, it does. Karen says the sunbeams are beautiful. Vijay also loves the sunbeams and the wild flowers. Meg says, I really like the diagonal coming through the forest photo. Yeah, actually, you can get the diagonals. It's always looking good. And Anya says, very helpful hints, Kim. Thank you. Excellent. Great. Well, I'm glad you found that useful. So, a little reminder then that if you do find these podcasts useful, informative, entertaining, and you would like to support them in some way, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is one of the ways you can do it. Always appreciated. Buy me a coffee, buy me two, buy me a coffee machine, buy me a coffee building, and we can have the photographer's cafe. How cool would that be? Right, okay. Yeah, the other thing, of course, if you haven't done so already, do subscribe to YouTube. Somewhere down there you'll find a button that says subscribe, but also make sure you click the notifications bell. That's going to be particularly important for next weekend, when I'm not going to be doing a direct podcast, but I am going to try several bits of live streaming. So if you get the little notification, you might get a ping and even see me live talking into my phone, trying to make sense of Spring Fling weekend. Anyway, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Tay Bridge says, very informative, thanks Kim, hope I can remember all this when the fog comes. Well, maybe bookmark this one, so next time you know there's fog, go back to episode 111, or if you know that you've seen the weather forecast saying it's going to be foggy tomorrow, come back, explore episode 111, read and make notes, and then go rushing out the following day. Right, okay, so now what I'm going to talk about is, we had the question of the week. Question of the week, I asked people this time on the Facebook group. So there's a Facebook group also called Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres. If you are on Facebook, then do go and join it. One of the things I tend to do is, when I remember it, is stick in a question of the week just as a kind of little bit of blether. Sometimes it is photography related. Quite often it's not. This week I happen to be doing a big photo shoot for a Mediterranean/Greek restaurant. So food was very much on my mind. Quite often is. And actually, to be honest, when I put in a food question, I tend to get many more answers and people chipping in than when I put in photography questions. Maybe that's where the photographer's cafe should come in, get the best of both worlds. But anyway, so my question this week was, what food did you love as a child? Was there a special treat you enjoyed from a parent, grandparent, or someone you would sometimes stay with? We all have these little food things that kind of come through to us from childhood. There's a really strange one that when I was in absolute infant school, I was about 5 years old, and I can still remember the smell of a particular dessert. I cannot remember what the dessert is, and I've never managed to come across it since, and I've never come across that smell since. And yet I can still remember the smell. I will probably go to my grave still never knowing what that dessert was, but very, very distinctive, pleasant, but no idea what it was. However, there are these childhood tastes which come through to us. From that, Julia said, Fry's chocolate cream from my papa or uncle was produced from the fireside cupboard as an extra special treat, often at Christmas. I always have one at Christmas to remind me of those special times long ago. Yeah, that's wonderful. Exactly that kind of thing, like a little bar of chocolate which reminds you specifically of that time. Robert said lasagna, also Twinkies. Now, Twinkies is one of those things you just don't get in the UK. It's one of the things I always see in American movies. Never had one in the UK. Now, I think I did try one when I went over to Canada once and really couldn't figure out what all the fuss was about. So I figured that this is probably one of those things which is one of the you have it as a child, and then kind of because you've had it as a child, it sticks with you. Mind you, April then answered Robert saying Twinkies used to taste good, not anymore. So have they changed the recipe? Or have your taste buds changed? That's the question. But April went on to say she loved carnation breakfast bars. I remember bringing them for lunch when in elementary school. I was addicted to them. Those were the days when things tasted better, less chemicals and more of the real thing. I would pay a good penny to have them again with the same exact recipe. And again, it's that thing that sometimes it's about the fact that recipes have changed, and sometimes just your taste buds change, and they just don't quite, things never quite taste the same as your memory, because you've kind of grown up and you're never in the same context. But can you be sure? Anya says, I remember my aunt bringing a tin of curly, crunchy brandy snap biscuits once, about 50 years ago now. Been dreaming about that tin of biscuits ever since. It's a long time to be dreaming about a tin of biscuits, but yeah, it makes that kind of impression. Brilliant. Stacey says, what I really loved was my Bubbles cooking. Now, I'm presuming Bubbles is an affectionate name for, I don't know, is that like an aunt, a mother, a grandmother, an aunt? Let me know who Bubbles was. Anyway, as I say, she made matzo ball soup and I enjoyed her chicken soup. Roy said, my dad's meat and potato pie was wonderful, especially the pastry crust. Jackie says, at Christmas and special occasions, of course, when in season, we had strawberries and cream. That always brings back the fondest memories. I'm thinking strawberries and cream at Christmas, not here, but of course, Jackie's in South Africa, Southern Hemisphere, entirely different set of fruit and veg that you get on the season. Muhyiddin said, lemon pie is the one for him. Ruth said, chocolate such as Hershey bars, M&Ms and brownies. Nadia says, my mum's homemade lemon and walnut baklava. Just thinking about it makes me drool. VG says, now she's told me how to pronounce this. And it's in Kaju as in juice. Kaju cutlet. Kaju cutlet. Brilliant. My favourite delicacy made out of cashew nuts. Ah, cool. Maura says bullseye candies and creamsicles. And Diane says, from my mum, lemon meringue pie. From my aunt, angel food cake. And from the lady who ran the cafeteria at the grammar school I attended, peach cobbler. So there you go. What a great sensor. What a great load of foods that are going to just tap into that kind of food memory. And now, having done a whole pile of food photography, at some point in the next month or two, I will probably do a podcast specifically on food photography, or at least the kind of food photography that I was doing for this restaurant. Shall give you a few hints and tips on that. Maybe then we could have a food photography challenge. That sounds like quite a good idea. So probably in the next month or two, we'll end up with that. Something to start having a think about. What have we got here? May Brit says very informative. Thanks, Kim. I hope. Oh yes, we did that one. VG says, photo coffee cafe. Binod says, I'm not on Facebook, so may I send you my picture on your email? Yes, you can. Absolutely. Because not every Rosemary, regular contributor, also isn't on Facebook. So if you want to put in a photo for critique, you want feedback, then email me kim@kimayres.co.uk. So send me your image and let me know what your sticking point is. Let me know why you're wanting the critique, where your problem is, and I will do my best to help. Stacey says, Bubble, that's my Jewish grandmother. She was my father's mum. Aha, so grandmother. Excellent. That makes sense. Karen says, a packet of raspberry ruffles. Raspberry ruffles. That sounds familiar. Grandmother's treat on a Saturday. And John says, great idea about a food photography podcast and challenge. Okay, great. Well, we'll stick that one on the list and we'll sort that out at some point, either towards the end of June or beginning of July. Excellent. Right. Okay. So thank you to everybody who sent in those responses, food responses. Oh, it's a great fun thing to do, I think. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at, we're on to the critique section. So, in basic introduction to the critique section, if you're not already familiar with it, this is your chance to send me your images and let me know what your sticking points are. We all have photos, we take the photos, we're never entirely sure. We might think they're good, or we might know that they're not working so well. We put them on social media, everybody tells us they're lovely, or they don't say anything at all, because most people don't want to be nasty. They tell you it's good, even if they don't know any different, because they're being nice, which is lovely. That's what friends are for. But it doesn't help our photography. So I developed this part of the podcast, this corner of the internet, is specifically to help you get past your sticking points. How are you ever going to learn how to improve if you don't know how to get past certain bits? So hopefully I can give you some ideas. So as I said, if we have the Facebook group, stick your images into the Facebook group with a description of what kind of critique you're hoping for, what kind of feedback you need, what your sticking points are. Or if you don't do Facebook, kim@kimayres.co.uk, email the image to me, same idea. If you've already heavily edited your photo, it's useful for me if you can send me the original as well, because sometimes people's sticking point is the fact that they've edited it in a way that's maybe worked against them rather than working for them. So with that in mind, let's move on then to the critique section and see what people have sent us. So the first one I'm going to start with here is Peter. So Peter sent us this photo and said, this was taken in the afternoon looking northeast as the sun was setting in the west. The lights, in quotes, on the buildings are in fact the reflected sun off the windows. I thought it would make an interesting photo as the buildings are barely visible through the mist, but the reflected sun makes the windows stand out. So yeah, absolutely. I looked at this and the first thing I thought was this was lights on in the buildings in the distance, but it actually turns out that no, that's the sun setting reflecting off the, so in fact actually, so rather than the sun being behind the building in the backlight, the sun is in fact behind the photographer but is reflecting off those windows. However, it's not lighting up any of the foreground, whether it's the shape of the hills or just the direction of the sun. So the foreground has just become a kind of mass here. So we're kind of into a little bit of a problem here. So in fact, let's just open this with Photoshop a moment and get a sense of what the build, what we're kind of up against. Because part of the problem is here, this photo is, we're not really seeing a lot. We're seeing the lines of these, the little red bit, by the way, that's just saying where highlights are blown. We're seeing lights kind of through but we're not really making out much of what's going on. And this is part of the problem when you're taking the mist photo. Now, if I click auto, it's darkened a little bit. I'm aware a little bit more of slightly darker trees in the corner here. Maybe I can kind of see, it looks like there's maybe a little bit of river down here in the bottom. But it's not very clear, little trunks of trees. Take off the auto for a moment. There's a dehaze function here, which if I push this way, plays around really with contrast and stuff for you, and then you can add in clarity if you want. The problem we end up with was when we do the dehaze, whilst it does kind of make it a bit clearer, is because there's not a lot of information in the picture to begin with, it then ends up, it's very, very noisy. So we sort of zoom in here and, the quality of the picture has kind of very quickly disappeared. Now we've also got, it's really struggling with the colour because there's not a lot of colour there. It's created all these kind of very deep blue. Maybe at this point you kind of may as well desaturate and go black and white. But having done that, we are still in the problem of the fact that there's not enough detail here. The other problem with going black and white, I've just realised, of course, is we've lost that wonderful golden glow. So let's not save that. Let's go. Right, is that having gone? I should have done this in a slightly different way. Open that with Photoshop again. And right, so let's bring that saturation back. Now, let's just open this like this, and then what I should have done was turn them black and white. And then, because what you can do then, if you really want, is if I take the hue saturation tool over here. In fact, I just realised put this in different workspace here, so I'm not covering any of the picture. Then what I can do is, instead of desaturating the whole lot, I can selectively desaturate. I could say I choose the blues, and then I can desaturate the blues, and in fact the yellows I could even up the saturation a little bit. Is that really going to work? Maybe just stretch that out a bit, and then if you want, you've still got that kind of slightly yellowish glow from there. Slightly careful about going too much in the way of selective colour, but at the same time it's kind of a bit odd anyway, because we don't, so the big problem here really is that there's just not enough information in the picture, so that when we try and get more detail out of it, there wasn't enough detail in the first place. And I think, to be honest, Peter, this is really where the tricky bit comes, is that the picture is so big and most of the picture just doesn't have enough detail to really give you the quality you want, that in a way what you're better off doing would be to maybe start off with, let's just, so if I go back to, just take everything back to 0 there, the original photo. That is to really take a part of it, and that if what you're really interested in is the reflections in the building and the little bit of tree, is essentially what we do is we crop in something like roughly rule of thirds-ish, something like that. Maybe is there something a little bit more out there? Not sure really what's out there, but yeah, maybe do something like that. Keep it slightly cinematic because it does look almost like some kind of alien world. And then maybe you work with something like this. Then, if you're wanting to create the haze, well, let's just take the opacity down a little bit and sort of mix that somewhere in between. So you've got enough, a bit of tree, a bit of, or okay, alternatively if I do that, what if I was to take the curves and just drag that down a bit? Oh, that makes it seem a bit more nighttime. So there are kind of ways you can play with it a bit, but ultimately you are kind of limited because there's just not enough information in there, and in essence too much of the photo is not enough information. So at that point you've really got to decide which bit is the most interesting part of the photo, and the most interesting part is this bit of building with the light reflecting off it. So that's the bit you kind of need to key into. So I hope that kind of makes sense, Peter. That if we go back to the full size one, there just isn't enough information around here to give you the bit. The bit that's really interesting is the way the light is reflecting off the buildings, but the rest of but for that, then I guess you probably need a bigger zoom lens, depending on how far away you were standing and how much you could get of it. But I hope that gives you a couple of pointers and thoughts there, Peter. Right. So where are we? Binod said, I sent you an email, please check. Well, I'll check it after the podcast. Diane says, hello from Florida's Gulf Coast. Hello, Diane, glad you could make it. I mentioned you earlier. You'll need to go back and check afterwards. I did a bit on the question of the week, and I did mention your peach cobbler, so do check that afterwards. Rosemary says, Peter was shooting in very thick fog. Is there a way to tweak the camera settings to include more information at the point of the shoot? It's a tricky one. What I would say is, you have to be really careful about overexposing. Always slightly better off slightly underexposing rather than overexposing, because by and large, depending on your software, you can usually retrieve a little bit more if you're shoot raw for a start rather than JPEG if you can, because you can then draw a few more extra details out of the shadows than you can out of the highlights. But really, it's about a lot of it is also the patience or the hunting, the moving around to find the best spot you can, rather than trying to rescue stuff afterwards. You want to try and get the best you can in camera so that you can rescue more if you need to. So as best as you can with your eyes, move around, shift to the left, shift to the right, move forward, climb over the fence, do whatever you need to try and find that space whereby you are getting the depth. Understand the depth, I think, that I was talking about, and that really helps. And ideally having this idea of something in the foreground again to help anchor the picture. That will make a difference over any amount of settings that you will do on the camera, as long as you haven't over or completely underexposed. Okay, next picture then, let's go to Jim, who is it Ditch Digger? I think, yes, Ditch Digger, in here. So Jim says, this is one of my only fog photos, a lonely park bench at night. So this is the one Jim sent. I was not sure what settings to use. It was really dark and very foggy. It was in Italy. The settings were way off for a typical night shoot. The exposure time is a tenth of a second, ISO 200 f8. So what we've got then is we've got the lamp nicely lighting up the tree, all these kind of foggy bits, and we've got the lamp post just about here. But what we can see here, given that this is a ISO 200, it is so noisy and streaky, and what's obviously happened is Jim's had to really pull all the information out of the shadows as best as he can, but the information isn't there, a bit like the problem we had with Peter's just now. And so the camera so everything ends up very noisy. So I asked him to send me the originals, which he did. So he sent me this one. This is the original photo, and the fact that we can't see anything down here just goes to show how much he's adjusted. And now if I click auto, we can then see that it's lit up a bit more. It's taken down some of the highlights, but we are still struggling to make out much of the detail within here. So if we want, we can try and take those shadows, boost the shadows a bit more, getting a little bit more information, tweak the clarity, something like that. Got to be careful we're not blowing out too much up here. And then we're kind of at the stage where I think Jim had kind of got to just allow those blacks to come up, but we've now got very noisy. So at this point you need to go into the detail and you need to go to noise reduction, and you kind of drag this up a little bit. But at that point then we're risking losing the detail, and you can have this race between sharpen and noise reduction and color reduction, all the rest of it, but in the end we're kind of running it. It's a tricky one. There just isn't the information in there to really be able to bring out the details. So we had a little bit of an exchange back and forth via email when he sent me this. And the other thing, of course, was the colour thing here as well. So if we go here and we knock down the vibrance or the saturation, you can knock it into black and white if you want, or you can even kind of do a slight colour shift, playing around that way as well. Now, he then sent me, so let's just open that to show you. So that's really the maximum we've managed to do that. So your first thought is, well, if there's not enough information for to bring out truly the detail underneath, maybe you do a longer exposure. So he then sent me another exposure. Now that first one was done for 1/10 of a second. This one was then done for 1/2 a second. But what we find is, whilst 1/2 a second is maybe going to bring out a touch more detail down the bottom, of course it makes the light even brighter. 1/2 a second is way too long for that light. Is just now, because of the fog, that light is now just blotting out almost everything, and we're still struggling to make out much in the way of detail at the bottom. And again, we can play around with, you know, noise reduction and what have you, but then we lose even more detail. So either way, whether you're doing 1/2 a second or you're doing 1/10 of a second, when you're photographing a single light, you've got this problem. Because if you expose so that the light itself isn't so overpowering, everything is lost in the shadows. If you expose for the shadows, then the bright light blows everything out. And that's really where the problem is. And the problem being that you've got a single light and everything in it is trying to be lit by one light source, which is overpowering. So in that case then, Jim, I think really this was why I pulled up this photo earlier as your kind of solution to it. I think the single lamp is always going to be problematic. Whereas if you can get more than one lamp in, that's where you've got a better chance of being able to do a foggy night situation. Try and get the light so that, you see, if I just took a section, let's just show you what I mean with this. If I just took a single light section, like that. Well, this one's too far away. Again, there's very little detail you can get out of that. But again, that's kind of true wherever I am. If I took this section, now, the only reason we can see some of this other stuff isn't because of this light, it's because of the lights behind. So this is really where it is. If I only had one light would have plunged everything else into darkness, and we would have just seen too much light here. But because we have the other lights working their way back, lighting up other parts, we're still very aware of it being misty and foggy, but we have that sense of depth. And the multiple light sources then are allowing us to really pick out more detail than we would have if it had been a single light source. So there's a limit to how much we can rescue from the photo you've got, quite simply because the information isn't there. You know, you've taken the photo, but the camera wasn't able to make the difference between that bright light, the way the light was diffusing through the fog, and the deep shadows. So if you can introduce more than one light source, then that makes a difference. And that's really the solution to that. So I hope that helps, Jim. Hope that gives you a few ideas of what to do next time you get a foggy night. But thank you very much for sending that one in. Right, okay, where am I? Let's click on that. Oh, Rosemary says, thanks, the physical feet attached to the camera. Yes, absolutely. Don't feel you have to be stuck with the position you're in. One of the first things to do is move around a bit and see if you can get a slightly better angle or composition. Jim says yes. Peter says, thanks, Kim. This was a low light through thick fog at 300 millimeters towards the nuclear power station, where your eyes give you more detail than the scene than the camera is able to catch. Yeah, that's always what happens. Is in the end, our eyes considerably more sophisticated than the camera. So part of our skills that we are developing as photographers is to be able to use the camera to try and give the impression of what the eye was seeing, even though it will never be able to. In exactly the same way I was talking earlier, we have depth perception. If we have two eyes that are both functioning, we have a 3D depth perception. The camera doesn't. It's a single lens, and we view it on a single piece of paper or a single screen, unless you're wearing 3D goggles. Different argument. So we have to give the illusion of depth, and that's part of. So our skill as photographers is about how to create these three-dimensional, bigger than, to tap into the brain, so the brain viewing the image has a bigger sense of what it's seeing than is actually there. We are magicians, really. Jim says, thanks, Kim. With this shot, that was the only light available. Yeah, but I will keep it in mind. What about HDR merging? Yeah, that's absolutely another idea. In that case, make sure you've got a tripod and keep the camera absolutely steady. If you're doing long exposures, the problem is the actual clicking of the camera can cause slight vibration and wobble, so that not everyone will be in focus. So either have a remote release, or if you don't have a remote release cable or Bluetooth, then set your camera for a 2-second timer, and then click several at different settings, underexposed right up to overexposed, and then you can merge them in the software later. So yes, that's another way of doing it if you really are stuck with only the single source. Right, okay, so thank you for that. So next one then we're going to talk about is Nadia. And Nadia said, sorry, in the wrong folder here. No, not that one. That's Diane. Nadia. So Nadia said, I captured this one on my mobile as I didn't have my Sorry. I captured this one on my mobile as I didn't have my DSLR with me. I didn't want to miss getting a picture of the fog, so it made my hubby stop so I could capture a quick snapshot. Not the best picture. Tay Bridge critique, please. So this is the Tay Bridge, which is up in Dundee. I know this. I went to Dundee University, so I recognise this. It's many years ago. And in some ways, you've got this fantastic old Victorian rail bridge, which disappears into the fog. So it should be an ideal shot. The tricky bit that we've got here is that where it really disappears across the Tay is now hidden behind this. So our sense of, because what we've got here is this is curving round. Now, if I zoom right in, you can just about make out further pillars here, because essentially this curves round onto the bridge and then goes in a straight line across the Tay. And that's where the real depth is. And that's the depth you really need to capture if you're going to do the Tay Bridge in the fog. So for that, either you needed to be further back towards Tesco's and towards the Discovery along the waterfront, so that you could see the Tay Bridge from the left of this picture, or you needed to be further along looking back so that you could get the length of the Tay Bridge, so you'd be further to the right of this picture and get that sense of depth going in. The problem here is that you've kind of missed, you're in the middle bit where it's not far enough, you're not getting the depth, it's only a little bit of depth before it disappears to where the real meat and potatoes of this actually happens. As such, it's kind of fairly flat, and then you've got a lot of space around it, and there's not a lot happening. There's limitations with what you could have done with your phone as well with this, because if you didn't have your phone and you're at this angle, I'd have said, again, the real kind of more fun part of this is you want to get the detail that's happening under the arches so that you can get the bridge behind the bridge, or the bridge, through the arches of the bridge. That's really where there's more story happening. This, unfortunately, isn't really giving it to us. So not a lot more I can really say to that one. I mean, you can play around with the crops, you can crop in, you can expand out. But ultimately, if you're going to try and get the Tay Bridge in the fog, you either needed to get your husband to stop before, or you needed to get him to stop later and shoot more from the sort of side and get that sense of the Tay Bridge disappearing into the fog. So I hope that helps. Hope that gives you a couple of ideas. Right, okay. VG says bridge shot is beautiful. Stacey says nice bridge shot, and VG says, does it curve? Yes, and that's the whole point. It curves. If anybody ever wants to go to Google Images after this podcast and Google the Tay Bridge, Tay, Tay Bridge, Dundee in Scotland, yeah, it curves round and then goes across the water. The other thing to do is be in an elevated position. If you're up on the law, if you're up on this sort of rise of hill, you can get that sense of the bridge. Unfortunately, at that point, though, of course, if it's foggy, you probably wouldn't see it. So a tricky one indeed. Right, okay. Next up then is Diane. So we're out of the fog photos now, just two more photos to talk about. Diane sent in this one, said, this is what I've been doing all weekend, Kim. This was last weekend. So she's been out photographing at horse jumping and what have you. And I think she's also doing that today, and it's going to be catching up with this podcast afterwards. This one was taken at midday, ISO 100, f7.1, and 200 millimeter. It's 70 to 300 millimeter lens set at 200 millimeters to catch this. Looking to improve her shoots for doing this. So, a fun little capture. You've square cropped it. You've got the horseshoe going through the middle, so it's a very kind of centre aligned photo. But you've got the action, the jump, and the diagonal of the horse leaping through, giving us that sense of movement and action. So quite a fun composition. Where the problem is here, of course, is the fact that the horse itself is out of focus. Now, it's not that the trees are in focus as well, but it's not that you focused in the wrong place, because this large horseshoe thing and fence is in focus as well. So the problem is motion blur. The problem is movement. And what you said is you've got is it 200th of a second? No, you've not told me what the is that. Oh no, I think it's 200th of a second. So 200th of a second isn't fast enough for this. Now you've got 100 ISO, which generally speaking is what you would want because it gives you a cleanest picture. It's not going to be so noisy. But 200th of a second just isn't enough to be able to capture the horse in movement. And really, what I would say for this is you need to up your ISO. Up your shutter speed. Put your ISO on auto. Okay, put your ISO on auto. Up your shutter speed to 500th of a second, 600th of a second, even 1,000th of a second, and try that. Now, it might mean that your picture would end up a little bit noisier, a little bit more ISO going on. But to be honest, better to have a sharp photo with a higher ISO than to have a lower ISO and an out of focus photo, because if the photo isn't in focus, you've kind of missed it. It doesn't matter that, because what you're trying to capture here is the horse, ideally the horse and the rider. The other problem we've got here is the rider's face is hidden behind the horse, and so whilst it's a nice action shot of the horse, you're kind of missing who the, if you're wanting, if the lass on the horse, if you're trying to capture a photo for her, it'd be kind of, obviously, mother or whatever would love to have a photo of the face as well. So, but stick it on a high shutter speed. You really want to capture that in focus. You need to get it sharp, so it means you've got to avoid the motion blur. Try 500th of a second. That might be enough. And do a couple of shots like that. Then zoom in on the back of the camera and see if you've still got a bit of motion blur at that, go up to 600, 800, even 1,000. Certainly 1,000th of a second, we should be able to capture it sharp. So we're always in this balance. Ideally, we want a low ISO because we want the quality to be there, so that if we print it up, we're not getting noisy pixels. But at the same time, no good having a great quality photo if it's actually out of focus. So, hope that helps, Diane. Hope that gives you a couple of ideas, and to make sure that, like I say, first and foremost, with something like that, make sure you've got a high shutter speed. Right, where are we at? John says, tips on the jumping horse were great, as I often shoot at horse shows as well. That's useful to know. Excellent. And Meg says, really like watching horses jumping because of the spectacular movement. It really is, yes. And the capture is great. That angle was brilliant. But it's just about making sure it's in focus. Okay, last photo I'm going to talk about now is Robert's. But do stick around, because I need to tell you all about next week and Spring Fling. And if you do have to run off early, I know Rosemary generally has to sort of shoot off by about this time. Do come back and watch it when you can. So now Robert took this photo. Says, this is a photo I took in February in Paris. It was early in the day, and I thought the lines and arches made the image very grand. I also like the lady walking towards me with her shadow to give a perspective in the space. I will go along with that. I remember composing this shot with my back to the wall. It was very difficult to capture as much of it as I did with the church due to the obstructions and the curvature of the path. Although this image shows many distorted aspects, I believe that helps tell the story. So Robert here is using very wide angle lens. I think it's a 15mm lens, but it's also on a full frame camera. So yeah, it would have been almost impossible to get a photo like this without a very wide angle lens, and with the objects or people in the near field of view, the exaggerations will be noticeable. So because he's using a wide angle lens, what we find is, whilst it's great having this woman in the foreground, she's become incredibly elongated, and to the point whereby it is quite unnatural. And some of these bits, so with a wide angle lens, as you go further out from the edges, it gets more and more distorted. So it is, and we've got the real kind of curve. It's an I really like this photo, and I love that sense of depth, and I think in a way the wide angle distortion helps a bit, but it is slightly problematic about the fact the woman in the front being really kind of stretched out so thin. Anyway, he goes on. I think my edit is too grainy, so this is a high, yeah, if I zoom in, there is there's sort of, yeah, fair bit of noise in the background here. But let's see, he goes on now. I can't remember what the settings were on this. I did have them scribbled down somewhere. Anyway, he says, however, I'm not certain that doesn't help with the aesthetic. Since I have a tendency to overcook, if you could help with better colour edits, I think it would also be good. Other suggestions are welcome. So what I'm going to do here now is wonderfully, Robert sent me the original as well. So here we have the original. Now you can actually see from the original, we've got that same amount of noise here. You can see the highlights are sort of blown slightly. And so he's actually done quite a lot of work to recover the detail, but that's really worked well. So actually, if I click auto on this, that's maybe not. Let's click here, take those highlights down a little bit, exposure down a little bit. Whites, don't need those whites quite as much. So I do that until the little red dots disappear. And so we've got that. Now, this at this point, the actual the actual colour is kind of very yellow, so there's a warm shift to it. And if we look at Robert's photo, he's taken some of that out, but I think you can kind of play around. If I take the temperature and nudge that to the left, you can see that you get quite a different kind of feel. So it's kind of, now go that too far and it's gone too blue. But you can see here that that's too blue, but actually at its natural, it's kind of too yellow. So what you're really doing is nudging this around until you get to somewhere which kind of feels like it's got a natural feeling. Now, but do you want a naturally slightly cool tint or a naturally slightly warmer tint? So you can kind of play around with that. What I'm going to do is just put that as shot again, and I'll show you another one of those in a minute. Just come back in here, get a little, take it, I think you managed to get, take those whites down, contrast down a little bit, get a little bit more detail out of here, highlights down a fraction. So now we've now got these, we've got the detail back into these incredible paintings on the wall. Now the other thing is given the fact that oh yeah, this is yes, here I've got I can see the details up here. It says ISO 3200. That's what's giving it a lot of noise. But you've got it on f2.8. This is very wide, so you try and let as much light in. Presumably it's quite dark here. But you've got it on 1/400th of a second. Now for a shot like this, you don't need anything like 400th of a second. You could have easily got away with 125th of a second, I think. Especially if your back's against the wall and you're able to hold the camera fairly steady. Plus it's wide angle, so that gives you a little bit more leeway. You might have even been able to get away with 100th of a second. Now if you've been able to get away with 100th of a second, you'd have easily then, your ISO would have only been something like about 400. I mean, these figures I'm kind of plucking out the air. However, it would have been considerably lower than 3200. And that would have meant that it would have been a lot less grainy and you would have had a much better quality photo. Unlike Diane's, where she's dealing with movement blur, because you've got a jumping horse, you don't have any jumping horses in here. Spectacular though that would be, you don't have the jumping horse in here. So the most you've got is a woman slowly working her way through here. So actually something like about 125th of a second would have been enough, and that would have also been able to give you the less grain in it. But within that anyway, what we can do is don't forget that there is always the detail bit here. And if I zoom in, let's sort of zoom in a little bit here, we can see I can take the sharpening down, nudge the noise reduction up until we've kind of lost most of the noise. Now we've lost a little bit of sharpness, so then we nudge the sharpness up a little bit until it gets sharper, but we've not got as much noise before it gets too noisy. So something like that. Then I'm going to click open. Let's just quickly close these other pictures as well. And so now when we with Robert's photo here, it's still in the kind of yellow. Another option, just quickly, if I click J here, is to go to image auto tone or an image auto color. Ah, there you see, quite a big difference. Now the auto color's really nudged it over into the blues, a kind of slight bluey green. Now maybe that's too far from the yellows that you had. So what you can do, now you've created another one, is you could just lower that layer until you get to a point whereby you can move it back and forth until you get to a point whereby you go, actually, you know what, that there maybe, how much do I want? Something like that. Personally, then it's a choice. I'm going to go there and say, you know what, I quite like that as a colour scheme. Now I've got them, I can select all, copy and paste, and I've now got one which has blended them together. Now the next thing, which is really about the notion of this distortion. There's two ways you can go about this. One is, actually I'll tell you what, I will duplicate that layer again. If you've got Photoshop, which I know you do have, you've got lens correction. Now there is a limit here to what lens correction can do. This is telling you what the lens profile is. And I can, if I go to custom, I can do things like remove distortion. If I push it that way, what happens is it sort of stretches the outside and shrinks in the inside. Or if I push it the other way, it now pushes the inside out. She's starting to become a bit more of a natural shape, although this is starting to swell a bit too much and looking slightly bubbled. So actually I don't really like it. Sometimes you can do that. A little bit of lens correction works quite well if you've only got a slight distortion. When you've got a big distortion, it's not necessarily working as well as it could have. So I'm going to cancel that. So your other option, sometimes this works, is what I will do is I will copy say, the bottom third to a quarter. I'm going to copy that and I'm going to paste that on top. And then, Control and T, we're going to transform. You can edit, or you can go edit, free transform. And then, now, what that allows me to do, if I grab this little bottom bit here, sorry, and pull it, now that will shrink or enlarge it. But if I hold down the Shift button, that anchors it, and I can kind of shorten the top or the bottom. Now, if I just pull this up a little bit, in fact, I'll tell you what, let's just go back again and Control T, so that we're zoomed in closer. Hold down that Shift button, drag this up. What I can do is I can pull this up until this woman here starts to look a little bit more natural. Now, what you can see is it's stretching more at the bottom than it is at the top. Because it's anchored at the top here, it's not really stretching that part as much. So you can see it stretches more, and it's the bottom, it's the end part, it's the bottom part of this which is most distorted. So by pulling this up, we can kind of get to say something like that, and now she looks a much more natural shape. So now, having done that, pull back out, what I can do is I can recrop this and just pull that up to where we've done that. And now she looks more natural. Now, you could, if you wanted, to go and do the same thing with the roof. If you felt the roof was too distorted, we could do exactly the same thing. We could take this bit here, copy, paste, Control T, and then again hold down the Shift button and do something like that, and then recrop that way. However, to be honest, at this point, the roof just looks a bit flatter than I really quite liked the way you had that before. So I will undo that and remove that. And I would say I like the distortion. I think for the roof, that works really well. The only real problem was the fact that the woman herself was just too thin and drawn out. But by kind of just cropping that bottom bit and squishing that bottom part back in, you managed to kind of recorrect her, but still keep those wonderful sense of curve and depth that comes out of this photo. So, a couple of things there then, Robert. So there was that whole thing about the changing that distortion, changing the colour, but also the other thing to remember with this is your noise came about because you had an ISO at 3200 because you were doing it at 400th of a second. You didn't need it to be as fast a shutter speed as that. So adjusting your shutter speed down to what's suitable for, and in a slightly low light condition, you're trying to get a slower shutter speed, down to what you can manage with if your hand held before your own hand wobble will kind of start creating blur. So I hope that helps. Hope that makes sense for you, Robert. Okay. VG says the cool filter brings out the old feel and the depth. And Anya says, wow, I'm impressed by that select stretched function, reduction function. Yeah, you play around with that. It's quite a fun way to do. So that's the critique section. So I hope you've all found that useful, and thank you to everybody for sending in the images. When you send in the images, it's not just you yourself who get to learn something. As you can see, everybody else learns something as well. So a real fun part of the critique for this. So now, finally then, the bit I want to talk about is next week. Now, next week is Spring Fling. Now, Spring Fling in this corner of Scotland, southwest corner of Scotland, is an open studio event. And typically you end up with 90 plus artists and makers open their studios to the public. And there's a whole kind of art trail you can go on. This is the 20th year. Every year they produce a booklet. There's different coloured trails you can go on. There's different artists you can see. You can find out everything about everyone. And this year I am Studio 51 on the pink route. And my wife Maggie is Studio 52. So in here we can see this picture here, which some of you may remember I took at the Dumfries Slow Fashion Movement. Over the page we have one of Maggie's pictures, printed a little bit dark to be honest, but anyway, and bits of blurb about her. Because the reason we're next to each other is because we're sharing a space. Now, it's not the studio for either of us. But a friend has lent us their space. They've got an outbuilding which has got electricity and roof, and it's quite a reasonable size. So we are sharing that space. So if you go to spring-fling.co.uk, if you happen to be in Scotland or in southwest Scotland, or would be visiting at that point, then between Thursday and Friday this coming week, the 2nd to the 5th of June, there are 96 studios, I think, in total. You can find out all about them on the Spring Fling website. If you're locally, there's all sorts of places like information centres and stuff where you can pick up brochures as well. And come and visit us. Come and visit me and Maggie. And also, for that matter, my daughter Meg should be there for sharing the space with us for a couple of days at least, possibly the entire amount. I'm going to be doing photography demonstrations. I'm also going to be doing a special offer. So a special offer for visitors only. So if you want to know more about that, then I turn up on either go and check out my social media stuff where I'm started talking about it, or turn up. Now, what this means though is because it's running Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday I'm not going to be able to do this podcast because I won't be here. I'm going to be there at this in this studio space, except for the fact that I won't have my entire desktop set up. I'm not going to have OBS, so I can't do a proper full-on podcast in the way that I normally do it. So the only thing I'm going to, and there isn't Wi-Fi there, so there is signal for the phone, so I'm going to have to use my phone maybe as a hotspot, but best I can do is maybe take a laptop. Really, I'm going to be limited to using my phone. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be trying out some live social media feeds. I've not really done this before, but whether it's Facebook, Instagram stories or reels, YouTube live stories or something like that, I'm going to try doing some live bits throughout the weekend, from the Thursday to the Sunday. When I remember, if I can give it a go, I'm going to try doing little short, off the phone, camera pointed at me, telling you what's going on, if there's anything interesting. So keep an eye out, tune in, set your Facebook, Instagram and YouTube settings for notifications so that you get little pings or whatever when I go live. And then you can always type in something and say hello. If you can, come and visit us in the flesh, that would be brilliant. Of course, more than half of you here are watching from different parts of the world, so I'm not really expecting you to fly over especially for that weekend. If you do, that would be brilliant, but it's not expected. So do watch out for these live interactions across the time. At the moment, I have no idea timings or anything. The whole thing is a massive experiment. But yeah, so could be fun. Could be disastrous, but then, hey, that can be a bit of a fun and laugh too. Right, okay, yes. Oh, Meg says, yeah, I'm going to be doing some baking for Spring Fling as well. This is true. Meg's going to be doing some baking, so we could end up with some gluten-free flapjack or Rocky Road. Still to fully pin it down yet. So if you turn up, you may well get a chance to snack on something rather lovely. Right, okay, that's us. Thank you ever so much to everybody who sent in the pictures, and all of you who've been commenting and giving me feedback. So I hope you've all learned a little bit more about fog photography. Next week, Spring Fling. The week after, I haven't decided yet, but keep an eye out on the Facebook group or the social media, and sooner or later something will crop up which tells you what we're going to be doing with. Failing that, just tune in back in at the same time in 2 weeks' time, and you will find the podcast going. Thank you ever so much once again to everybody who's not that one, that one, yeah. So take care, and I will see you all, if not next week, then in 2 weeks' time. But hopefully next week, try and find my little live, my live social media feeds. Okay, take care, bye bye.